In the final days of September 1879, in the Cannon Butte Basin, while most homesteaders were busy with the sensible work of survival, stacking firewood shoulder high, sodding the walls of their cabins, and raising heavy plank snow fences against the coming winter, Parker Vail was doing something else entirely. He was doing none of those things first. Day after day, he dug into the already hardening earth, sinking young cedars into the ground in strange circles around his small cabin. With a spool of barbed wire, a hammer, and sharpened cedar posts, he paced out slow, deliberate rings, carefully measuring each gap, 12 feet from the wall, then 22, then another angle farther north where the wind was fiercest. Nothing about it looked random. Inside the cabin were his pregnant wife, Mara, and their 8-year-old son, Benny, who helped him carry the posts in the biting wind. Travelers passing by would slow their wagons just to stare. Some shook their heads and laughed aloud. Others looked to the heavens and muttered that Parker Vail had lost his mind. They could see Parker wasn't building a wall. The gaps between the saplings were just as important as the trees themselves, and that was the part no one could understand. To them, it didn't look like construction. It looked like a man quietly gambling his family's life on a crazy idea. And if he was wrong, the blizzard would offer no forgiveness for that mistake. What secret did those fragile rings of trees hold? Would Parker's gamble become a sanctuary for his family, or their living tomb? Subscribe to witness this fateful confrontation. One cold afternoon, a freight wagon creaked to a stop beside the Vail claim. The driver was Gideon Pike, a former Union cavalryman who had spent more winters on the frontier than most men in the basin combined. His beard had gone gray years earlier, not from age alone, but from wind, hunger, and too many storms survived the hard way. He stared at the rings of young cedar around the cabin for a long moment without speaking. Then, his expression changed. Not amusement, not confusion, recognition. Gideon climbed down slowly from the wagon and walked toward the nearest row of saplings, his boots crunching against frozen dirt. Mara watched from the cabin doorway, one hand resting low against the child growing inside her. "You know what drift snow does to a house?" Gideon finally asked. Parker kept digging. Gideon looked toward the northern ridge as if seeing another winter entirely. "In '68, my brother built too close to a snow pocket outside Fort Benton. Storm rolled through 3 straight nights. Drift climbed over the roof, covered the chimney. They found him come spring sitting against the wall, with a shovel still in his hands. The wind hissed through the cedar needles. Gideon pointed at the rings surrounding the cabin. "Snow near a house ain't shelter," he said quietly. "It's a grave waiting to happen." Then his eyes settled on Mara. "You're teaching the storm where to bury your family." Ruth Pike, Gideon's wife, had stayed silent through most of the conversation, but before climbing back onto the wagon, she looked toward Mara with an expression that carried more pity than cruelty. The older woman's eyes drifted across the half-finished cedar rings, then toward the thin wood piles stacked beside the cabin. "Fancy ideas don't keep babies warm," she said softly. "More wood does. A proper snow fence does." Mara said nothing. The wagon rolled away slowly through the dry prairie grass while the basin wind pushed dust along the frozen ground behind it. Gideon never looked back. Ruth did once. Parker returned to measuring the next row of saplings. Hammer strikes echoed across the empty land. Calm, precise, almost stubborn. But the silence around the cabin felt different now. As evening settled over Cannon Butte Basin, Mara stood in the doorway wrapped in a wool blanket, watching her husband work beneath the darkening sky. Benny was asleep inside already. The fire cracked softly behind her. For a long time, only the wind spoke. Then she finally asked the question that had been growing inside her all afternoon. "Parker, are you sure about this?" The hammer stopped. Not for long. Just long enough. Long enough for her to understand that he knew exactly how much he was risking. That night, after Benny had fallen asleep beside the stove, Parker sat quietly at the table sharpening a cedar stake with his knife. The lantern light flickered across the cabin walls, while the basin wind moved outside like something restless and alive. "I ain't trying to stop the wind," he finally said. Mara looked up from the blanket she was sewing. "I'm trying to break it apart." He explained how snow drifted hardest where a single strong current stayed whole. But once wind was split into smaller currents, once it lost shape and rhythm, it lost strength too. A hard wind stays dangerous, Parker said softly. A broken wind gets tired. For the first time, Mara began to understand that the trees were not a fence, they were a filter. Years earlier, when Parker worked as a young survey assistant in the mountains of Idaho Territory, he had watched a winter storm flatten an entire logging camp in one night. Thick plank windbreaks shattered. Canvas shelters disappeared beneath white drifts. Men spent half the morning digging out frozen tools and trapped mules. But farther uphill stood an abandoned trapper shack, hidden behind a crooked stand of young pine. The place barely had a drift against its walls. That sight stayed with him. Not because the trees had stopped the storm. They had not. The wind still moved through them. But it moved differently, broken apart, uneven, tired. From that winter on, Parker began reading snow the way other men read tracks in mud. Drift lines became maps. Empty spaces behind trees became lessons. And slowly he realized something most frontier men never considered. The most dangerous wind was not always the strongest one. Sometimes it was the cleanest one. Over the next several days, the strange pattern around the Vale cabin slowly began to reveal its purpose. The outer ring was made from young lodgepole pine, taller trees, wider spacing. Parker placed them roughly 22 feet from the cabin walls, leaving gaps close to 7 feet apart. Their job was not to block the basin wind. It was to lift it, to force the hardest current upward before it slammed directly into the house. Closer to the cabin stood the cedar choke ring. Those trees were shorter, denser, and planted tighter together, 3.5 feet apart in some places. Parker called them the rough teeth. Once the wind dropped lower again, the cedar branches would break the current into smaller pieces, disrupting the clean flow that carried hard-packed snow. Between both layers sat the real heart of the design, empty space, a quiet basin of still air surrounding the cabin itself. Benny followed his father from stake to stake, carrying coils of measuring rope, while Parker checked every angle again and again. Some openings between the trees looked almost like mistakes, but they were intentional. Small drift lanes pointed away from the front door and goat shed so snow pressure would escape sideways instead of piling against the walls. Nothing in the layout was symmetrical for long. Parker adjusted constantly depending on the shape of the land and the direction of the basin wind. Mara watched much of it from the porch without interrupting. The work no longer looked random to her. It looked calculated, exhausting, precise. Parker Vale was not building a wall against winter. He was building a machine designed to exhaust the storm before it reached his family. The work itself became a punishment measured in miles. Nearly every morning before sunrise, Parker hauled a homemade rope sled north toward a narrow ravine almost 2 miles from the cabin, where young cedar and pine still grew thick along the protected creek banks. The basin ground near the homestead was too exposed, too dry. The saplings there would never survive winter planting. The good trees grew where the wind struggled to reach. Parker dug each one out by hand. Slow work, careful work. He cut wide around the roots to preserve the frozen soil holding them together, then wrapped every root ball in old canvas grain sacks soaked from creek water. By midday, the sled weighed enough to drag deep grooves through the prairie grass on the journey home. His gloves eventually split at the palms. Blood darkened the fabric around his fingers. His shoulders stayed stiff even after dark. Some nights Mara could hear him trying not to groan while removing his coat beside the fire. Still, every morning he went back out again. Benny began helping without being asked. The boy steadied saplings while Parker packed dirt around the roots. He learned to tell red cedar from lodgepole pine by smell alone. The sharp cedar scent stayed on his small hands long after sunset. One evening, while cold wind pushed dust against the cabin walls, Benny looked up from the half-filled planting hole. "Will the trees really stop winter?" he asked. Parker pressed frozen dirt down around the roots before answering. "No," he said quietly. Then he glanced toward the northern basin, where the first hard clouds of winter were beginning to gather. Just part of it. The first storm arrived earlier than anyone expected. Not a true blizzard, not yet, but strong enough to test weak ideas. Cold wind rolled down through Cannon Butte Basin just after midnight during the first week of November. Snow came fast behind it, sharp, dry, driven sideways across the prairie hard enough to rattle the cabin shutters before dawn. At first, Parker believed the system was working. The outer pine line caught the first push exactly where he intended. Snow began collecting beyond the cabin instead of against it. But then, the wind shifted slightly west. That was when the problem started. One section of the outer ring had been planted too evenly. The spacing created a smooth channel instead of broken turbulence. Wind rushed through the gap, curled backward, and slammed snow directly toward the goat shed behind the cabin. By sunrise, one entire corner of the drift had piled chest high. 2 young pines bent nearly flat beneath the weight. Another snapped at the trunk. Gideon Pike rode past later that morning and saw the damage immediately. He said nothing at first. He only stared at the half-buried shed and the collapsed saplings sticking from the drift like broken arrows. Then he looked at Parker. "Told you the storm only needs one opening," he muttered. That night, while Mara and Benny slept inside, Parker stayed outdoors alone with a lantern hanging from a cedar branch. White gusts moved around him in violent waves while he studied the drifting snow inch by inch, not fighting the storm. Reading it, near midnight, he finally saw the truth. The wind was not failing to stop. It was rebounding, rolling backward through the evenly spaced gap and rebuilding speed before reaching the cabin line. By dawn, Parker had already begun digging. He ripped nearly 10 saplings from the frozen ground and repositioned them by hand despite the cold. Wider gaps in one section, narrower choke points in another, angled openings to bleed snow sideways away from the shed. Mara watched silently from the doorway wrapped in a blanket, while pale morning light spread over the basin. Her husband stood alone in the blowing snow, rebuilding the very system that had nearly failed his family on its first real test. 3 days after the storm, an old trapper named Elias Crow rode into the basin with a string of half-frozen pelts hanging behind his mule. Elias had spent so many winters alone in the northern territories that people sometimes joked he trusted weather more than men. Unlike Gideon Pike, he did not laugh when he saw the cedar rings around the Vale cabin. He barely spoke at all. Elias dismounted slowly and walked the perimeter in silence, while Parker continued resetting saplings near the western drift lane. The old trapper studied everything: the shape of the snow piles, the flattened prairie grass beneath the pines, the way loose powder settled unevenly near the cedar choke ring. More than once, he stopped simply to listen. The wind moving through the trees sounded strange now, broken, uneven. Certain gusts vanished entirely before reaching the cabin wall. Benny watched the old man carefully from beside the woodpile. Finally, Elias crouched near one of the drift lines and brushed snow through his fingers. That was all at first. Then he looked toward the basin ridge, where the north wind usually came through clean and hard. "Wind don't sound right around this place anymore," he said. Not praise, not agreement, just observation. Parker rested both hands on the shovel handle for a moment, following Elias's gaze toward the drifting snow between the trees. The old trapper still looked unconvinced, but he no longer looked amused either. For the first time since the planting began, someone besides Parker had noticed that the storm itself was starting to behave differently. Parker gave a small nod, then quietly returned to digging. By the final week of November, the work around the Vale cabin was finally finished. 73 saplings stood rooted in the frozen prairie soil. 3 staggered rings stretched around the homestead in uneven patterns that only Parker fully understood. The outer pines faced the basin wind. The dense cedar choke ring sat tighter near the cabin walls. Between them rested the dead air basin Parker had spent weeks trying to create. From a distance, the entire thing looked absurd. Thin trees, thin trunks, barely taller than a man in some places. Beyond them stretched the enormous gray sky of the northern plains, empty and merciless. No reasonable person looking at that cabin would have believed those saplings could stand against a Dakota winter. Gideon Pike certainly did not. One afternoon, while speaking beside a freight wagon near the Basin Trail, he glanced toward the Vale claim and shook his head slowly. "First real blizzard's gonna bury that fool alive," he told the others. Nobody argued. Meanwhile, Parker changed something else around the cabin that few people noticed at first. Instead of stacking firewood directly against the outer wall, like every winter before, he began moving most of the split pine inside the open space between the cedar rings and the house itself. Inside the calm zone, Benny helped carry the logs one armload at a time while Mara watched silently from the porch. The air had turned colder now. Even the sunlight looked pale and thin across the basin. Parker worked steadily without explaining himself, but his actions made one thing painfully clear. This was no longer an experiment he hoped might work someday. He was preparing to trust his family's survival to it before the first true blizzard ever arrived. During the second week of December, the temperature fell so fast that water left in buckets formed skin ice before noon. The sky over Cannon Butte Basin turned the color of old iron, flat, pale, endless. Then the wind disappeared, not weakened, gone. Old settlers in the territory had a name for silence like that. They called it the held breath, the moment before the plains exhaled violence. Parker had seen the same stillness years earlier in Idaho, before whiteout storms erased entire valleys. From that morning forward, he moved through the homestead with quiet urgency. He hauled extra water from the well until the rope burned stiff against his gloves. He reinforced the goat shed door with another timber brace. But more than anything else, he checked the cedar lines. Again and again. Not the cabin walls, not the roof, the drift lanes. He studied every opening between the saplings, measuring where snow pressure would escape once the basin winds arrived. Occasionally, he would kneel in the frozen grass and stare toward the northern ridge for nearly a minute without moving at all. Mara watched him from the doorway, while one hand rested beneath the heavy curve of her stomach. For weeks, she had tried to trust the work, tried to trust him. But the silence outside frightened her more than the wind ever had, because silence meant the storm was gathering itself somewhere beyond sight. Late that evening, while Parker secured another cedar branch near the western lane, Mara stepped onto the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket. "What if the wind changes?" she asked quietly. Parker looked out across the empty gray basin. This time, he did not answer right away. The blizzard arrived just before sundown, not with gentle snowflakes, but as a single violent blow. Hard ice crystals shot sideways like sand, and the wind roared down from the northern ridge, shaking the cabin hard enough to wake Benny from his sleep. "What was that?" the boy cried. Mara pulled him close as another gust slammed into them, the sound a deep howl that was worse than thunder. But Parker Vale was already by the north wall, not watching, but listening. As the storm intensified into a continuous force, burying the windows in a spinning white void, he noticed something strange. The structure groaned, yet the sharp whistle that usually screamed across the roof was weaker now, broken. The heavy pounding force he remembered from past winters was gone, replaced by strange, uneven pulses, as if the current was losing its shape before it could strike. Then he heard a new sound, not an impact, but a long, rushing hiss traveling above the roofline instead of against it. That was it. Without a word, he grabbed the coil of rope by the door. "Parker," Mara began, her voice tight with fear. "I'll be 10 seconds, he said, tying one end to his waist and the other to a heavy porch beam. He forced the door open against the snow, and the storm exploded inside. Benny cried out as Parker stepped into the roaring white chaos. The cold hit like a hammer, but through the blinding snow he saw it. The drift line was forming exactly where he'd planned it, beyond the outer cedar lane. The snow wasn't piling against his home, it was being forced upward, climbing over the cabin in broken waves. The storm was being redirected. For a long moment, Parker just stared as the blizzard curled high above the cedar tops like smoke pulled through invisible channels. The redesign had worked. Not perfectly, but enough. For the first time since winter began, he allowed himself to believe it. It might actually hold. The storm did not pass the next morning, or the morning after that. For nearly 3 days, Cannon Butte Basin disappeared beneath a white darkness so complete that even the idea of distance seemed to vanish. There was no visible horizon beyond the buried windows. No sunrise. No sunset. Only shifting shades of pale gray moving through the storm outside. Inside the cabin, time changed shape. Hours were no longer measured by clocks. They were measured by the number of logs Parker fed into the stove, by how much stew remained in the iron pot near the fire, by the sound of Benny murmuring in uneasy sleep beneath his blankets, while wind pressure groaned through the walls around him, and by Mara's pain. Twice during the second night, sharp false contraction aka calms forced her to brace herself against the edge of the table until the pain passed. Each time Parker felt cold fear tighten inside his chest harder than anything the storm itself could produce. Because there was nowhere to go now. No doctor. No wagon trail. No chance of crossing the basin alive in a whiteout. The cabin had become its own isolated world. Parker slept little. Sometimes not at all. He sat beside the lantern listening to the storm and running calculations silently through his mind. Drift load against the outer ring. Snow pressure near the western lane. Airflow changes when the wind shifted north-northwest. Possible collapse points if the cedar choke ring iced too heavily before dawn. Again and again his eyes drifted toward the ceiling beams, waiting, listening. But another detail slowly became impossible to ignore. The cabin was warmer than it should have been, not warm enough for comfort. This was still frontier winter. Frost still crept along the corners of the window glass, but the heat inside lasted longer between stove loads than any previous winter Parker could remember. The firewood pile was shrinking slower too. Outside, the storm continued, throwing snow against the cedar rings, and somewhere beyond those buried lines, the drift wall kept growing thicker, denser, insulating. Late on the third night, Parker looked across the dim cabin toward Mara sleeping restlessly near the stove, while one hand rested protectively over the child inside her. And, for the first time since the blizzard began, a terrible thought settled fully into his mind. If he had miscalculated the airflow even one more time, every person he loved would die inside this cabin before spring. On the morning of the fourth day, Parker woke to something so unfamiliar that it took several seconds to recognize. Silence. No roaring wind. No pressure against the walls. Nothing. The stillness inside Cannon Butte Basin felt almost painful after 3 straight days of storm. Parker pulled on his coat slowly, took up the shovel beside the stove, and walked toward the door. Mara watched him without speaking while he lifted the heavy wooden bar from its brackets. Neither of them knew what waited outside. Maybe 10 feet of packed drift. Maybe a buried cabin. Maybe proof that the entire idea had failed. Parker wrapped one hand around the frozen latch and pushed carefully against the door. The hinges creaked once. Then the door moved. Cold air drifted softly into the cabin as Parker stepped outside and stopped dead in the snow. For several long seconds, he could only stare. The storm had built exactly where he wanted it to. Beyond the outer cedar lanes rose a massive, curved drift wall, nearly level with the lower edge of the cabin roof. Snow packed thick and hard around the outer rings, forming a white barrier that stretched around the homestead like the rampart of a frontier fort. Only the upper cedar tips remained visible above the drift, dark green points jutting from the snow like sharpened stakes. But inside the basin around the cabin itself, the ground remained shockingly clear, not bare, never bare, but covered only by a shallow layer of soft powder instead of crushing drift load. The pathways between the cabin, woodpile, and goat shed still existed beneath a few inches of snow and the air. The air inside the ring barely moved at all. Beyond the drift wall, Parker could still hear distant wind rolling across the basin. But here, the violence had lost its shape. The strongest currents had been lifted upward, broken apart, then forced to dump their snow beyond the target zone, exactly as he had hoped. The redesign after the November failure had saved them. Parker slowly turned toward the chimney. Smoke rose straight upward into the pale gray morning sky without bending. That sight struck him harder than anything else. No violent crosswind, no roof hammering, no buried doorway, only stillness. The storm had not been stopped. It had been redirected. For weeks, the basin had mocked the idea of thin saplings standing against a Dakota winter. Yet now the snow itself had become insulation packed around the outer rings, while the wind had unknowingly built a protective barrier around the people inside. Nature had done the labor for him. Parker stepped farther into the calm basin, looking at the towering drift wall surrounding his family's cabin, and finally understood the full truth of what he had created. He had not built a defense against the storm. He had taught the storm how to build one for him. It took nearly 2 more days before the basin trails became passable again. By then, most of the homesteads, north of Cannon Butte, looked half-buried beneath uneven drifts. Snow fences had collapsed. Wagon paths vanished under hard-packed white ridges. Men spent entire mornings digging open barn doors and clearing chimneys before another freeze sealed them shut again. Gideon Pike rode toward the Vale claim, expecting to find the worst. The old veteran had already decided what he would discover there. A buried cabin, a blocked chimney, maybe Parker frozen somewhere outside beneath the drift line he had foolishly created himself. That was what storms did to bad ideas on the frontier. They killed them. But as Gideon crested the final rise overlooking the claim, he suddenly pulled the reins tight. Smoke. A thin gray column rose calmly into the pale winter sky. Not sideways, straight upward. Farther below, inside the strange ring of snow surrounding the cabin, Benny Vale was dragging a small wooden sled through shallow powder while laughing at something his mother said near the porch. Mara stood wrapped in a heavy shawl hanging wet cloth beside the cabin wall, as though this were any ordinary winter morning. And Parker was calmly shoveling a narrow path between the woodpile and the goat shed. Gideon stared in silence. The massive drift wall beyond the cedar lines stood nearly as high as the cabin roof itself. Yet the space inside remained strangely untouched. The basin around the cabin looked protected. Sheltered. Wrong. He dismounted slowly and pushed forward through deep outer snow until he crossed the drift boundary. Then he stopped again. The wind disappeared, not weakened, gone. Beyond the wall, the plains still groaned beneath winter gusts. But inside the cedar rings, the air sat almost perfectly still. Gideon could hear his own boots crunching in the powder. He could hear the faint creak of the porch rope beside Mara's laundry line. The storm had broken around the cabin instead of through it. For a long time, Gideon said nothing at all. He simply studied the drift wall, the cedar tops sticking through the snow, and the strange, calm Parker Vale had somehow carved from the middle of a Dakota blizzard. Finally, he looked toward Parker with something close to disbelief in his tired old eyes. "You didn't stop the storm," he said quietly. His gaze drifted upward toward the towering white barrier surrounding the basin. "You taught it where to break." Parker rested both hands on the shovel handle, but gave no proud answer. Because standing there inside the silence, the storm itself had built around his family, no explanation was necessary anymore. When spring finally reached Cannon Butte Basin, it arrived slowly. Snow retreated from the plains in uneven patches. Meltwater carved dark channels through the drifts beyond the cedar rings, and the prairie grass beneath began showing pale hints of green again. But even after the thaw, the shape of the winter remained visible around the Vale cabin. The massive drift wall had left its mark on the land. So had the story. Gideon Pike returned first. This time he did not arrive with warnings or hard opinions. He carried no certainty at all, only questions. Parker found him standing beside the outer pine ring, one cold morning holding a length of measuring rope in rough, weathered hands. "How far apart did you set these?" Gideon asked. That was how it began. Before long, other homesteaders started appearing at the claim as well. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they had spent too many winters losing woodpiles, livestock, or half their roofs to basin storms. A few simply wanted to see the strange fortress the blizzard had built with their own eyes. Parker never turned the visits into speeches. He walked them quietly through the rings instead. He showed them how wind shifted when forced through staggered openings. He explained why solid walls created hard rebounds instead of softer turbulence. He pointed toward the drift lanes, where snow pressure had escaped, safely beyond the cabin zone. Sometimes he would stop and let the wind explain the rest itself. Benny often followed behind carrying stakes and rope, while the grown men copied measurements into small notebooks or scratched them into wagon boards with charcoal. One afternoon, Elias Crow stood beside the outer drift scar and watched another family measuring cedar spacing near the ridgeline. Then the old trapper gave a small grunt of amusement. "Folks'll be building Vale rings all over this basin before long," he muttered. The name stayed, and for the first time, Parker Vale began to understand something larger than survival itself. The idea that nearly got his family killed that winter might outlive the storm that tested it. The Vale cabin stood in Cannon Butte Basin for more than 40 years after the winter of 1879. The cedar rings did not remain saplings for long. Season after season, their roots pushed deeper into the prairie soil while their branches thickened into a living barrier around the homestead. The outer pines rose taller with every passing winter, bending the basin wind upward long before it reached the cabin walls. Over time, the strange little fortress stopped looking strange at all. It simply looked permanent. Benny Vale grew into a man inside that calm basin of still air, learning to read drifting snow the same way his father once had in the mountains of Idaho. And the child Mara carried through the great blizzard that winter, a daughter born the following spring, spent her earliest years playing beneath cedar branches that had once been thin enough to snap in a man's hands. The storms never stopped coming to the northern plains. They still crossed the basin with the same violence. Still buried wagon trails. Still punished careless men who believed strength alone could outfight winter. But around the Vale homestead, the wind always moved differently. Travelers heading north through Dakota Territory sometimes noticed the place from miles away during winter storms. A dark green ring, standing alone in the middle of endless white prairie. Quiet, sheltered, unnatural almost. Some called it luck, others called it frontier wisdom. But the people who truly understood the story knew better. Parker Vale had never defeated the winter. He had simply studied it long enough to understand that nature did not always reward the strongest man. Sometimes it rewarded the man willing to listen. And in the end, the same storm that might have buried his family became the thing that built their shelter instead. Do you think Parker Vale was truly brilliant? Or was he simply one of the few men willing to listen to what winter had been teaching all along? Let us know in the comments.